Okay, welcome back to the rest of energy flow in an ecosystem. So this time we're going to talk about trophic levels, but to do that we have to start with a quick refresher of what that food chain was again. So a food chain shows one path of the flow of energy in an ecosystem. Like we talked about before, it's going to start with the energy source of usually the sun. For photosynthetic ecosystems, there are again some chemosynthetic, but we focus mostly on the photosynthetic in this class. Then you have a producer, and then you have a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer, and a decomposer. So we've talked about what the producer is already, and we have talked about consumers as a group, but we haven't necessarily broken down these yet. So let's do that next. Okay, so often you will see trophic levels represented in some sort of pyramid fashion, and when we talk about different kinds of energy pyramids later on in this video, that we'll get more detail out of that. But for right now, let's translate those producers and consumers onto a trophic level pyramid. So effectively what you have is this represents the flow of energy. Energy flows this direction in the ecosystem. And to do that, it flows through various organisms. So at the most basic level, you have the producers, which are actually taking the inorganic molecules and creating some form of organic molecule. Often that is represented by glucose, but there's a variety of biological macromolecules that it will create. From there, you go to primary consumer. Often this is represented, that primary can be represented like that. So primary consumer, so the producer produces the original organic energy that will be used. A primary consumer is generally an herbivore, which is consuming the producer and gaining their energy from that. From there you have a secondary consumer. Secondary consumers will consume primary consumers. And then you have the tertiary consumer. So these are often carnivores or herbivores, or excuse me, carnivores or omnivores, not an herbivore. These are herbivores. These are carnivores or omnivores. These are often carnivores, and the energy is flowing this direction. And then you have the decomposers, which will cycle the nutrients, will get their energy from the dead material from any of these levels and cycle the non-energy nutrients back in to the soil so that the producers can then gain those nutrients, use the energy from the sun to combine CO2 and water to make the actual glucose molecules or sugar-based molecules, carbohydrate-based molecules that they will later use for energy. Okay, so again, you have the sun, producers harvest the energy from the sun to create organic molecules. That energy is then transferred into the herbivores or the primary consumers. When the secondary consumers consume a primary consumer, the energy transfers up again, and then up to the tertiary level. And the reason it is this triangle shape, because this also represents the amount of energy available. So each level you go up, there's less energy. This is effectively why you'll see in an ecosystem, the most populous organisms will be the producers, and the least populous will be the apex predators or the tertiary consumers. So when that's represented in food chain form, you have the sun again producing the energy, the original energy. Grass is harvesting, any producer, but in this case grass is harvesting the energy from that. That's being transferred to the mouse, which is the primary consumer, and then that is transferred to a kestrel, in this case a secondary consumer, and not very many things will eat kestrels. Sometimes some larger hawks will eat kestrels. So you might have a larger raptor here that would then be your tertiary consumer depending upon your ecosystem. The truth of the matter, though, is that food chains are an oversimplified version of what's really going on in an ecosystem. They show one direction of energy flow. A more accurate version would be a complete food web for an ecosystem. So this is a model that shows the energy flow through all the different organisms and consists of many overlapping food chains. So you take all the different food chains that might be in a particular ecosystem and you combine those into one model, and that will give you this web idea, or a food web. So what does a food web actually look like? This is an example of a food web from our area. So here we have our primary producers. We usually just refer to that as producers. In this case, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, some cacti, some various wildflowers. Our primary consumers will eat various parts of these, or different species of these, and this could include ground squirrels, it can include insects, pronghorn, mule deer, things of that nature. Then we have our smaller predators, carnivores, insectivores, omnivores, such as the bats and snakes, badgers, lizards. Then you finally have the top level, larger predators, the raptors, the coyotes, the cougars, the things that will eat these lower levels. So in here you can pick out a particular food chain. So let's say you take sagebrush, or some sort of brushy species of plant. That would be your producer. If the pronghorn browses on that, there's your primary consumer. And then when the mountain lion consumes, hunts and eats a pronghorn, you have here your secondary consumer. So even though in this case the cougar is at the very top of the food chain, there's still only a secondary consumer in this particular food chain. Now for a different example, you might have the insects that are feeding on the various plants. So here you have your primary consumer, and then from there the lizard that's feeding on the insects. Here is your secondary consumer, and then you have the coyote that might be feeding on the lizard. So the coyote in this case would be a tertiary consumer, but at the same time the coyote could be a secondary consumer. So if you go back to this original one we talked about with the cougar, you have the same producer, you have the same primary consumer, and in this case, when the coyote consumes the mule deer or the pronghorn, it represents a secondary consumer. So the same organism can represent a variety of levels, of different trophic levels in any given ecosystem, and this is why food webs get so complex, but they're a much more accurate representation of what's going on in an ecosystem. Okay, so then we use various forms of these pyramids to model how energy is flowing through trophic levels in an ecosystem. So it's a good representation of the structure because you have the majority of the energy that's in an ecosystem down at the base where the producers are. Again, this is why you see much more plant material in any given ecosystem than you will apex predators. And then at the top here, at your tertiary level, you have very few apex predators because the energy is lost as we go up, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So there's three different kinds we'll talk about today. We'll talk about a pyramid of numbers, a biomass pyramid, and then also the most important one that we're usually going to focus on, which is an energy pyramid. Let's start with the pyramid of numbers. This will represent, you can see the pyramid underlying this, right? This represents actual numbers of organisms that can or is supported or is found in any given ecosystem. For example, in this case, you might have 1,000 green plants. Those 1,000 green plants can support 50 snails. Those 50 snails, that population of 50 snails, every 50 snails you find can support 20 blackbirds. Every 20 blackbirds you find can support one hawk. So it has to be this pyramid shape because you can't invert this in most ecosystems. For example, you can't have 1,000 hawks supported by just one single green plant, right? That doesn't make sense. One plant couldn't support enough snails to support enough blackbirds to support 1,000 hawks. You can also have a biomass pyramid. So bio meaning life and mass meaning, matter, actual how much something is, grams. So this is the total dry weight. And this is important to remember that it's dry weight without water. You are some 70% water. So if you actually dehydrate yourself, you can think about this like what jerky looks like compared to a steak, or what a dried piece of fruit looks like, or a raisin compared to a grape, or a dried piece of mango compared to an actual mango. Dry weight, there's much less mass once you take out the water. And these biomass pyramids are usually in dry area, and they're often in mass per area. So how much mass, dry weight of living organism is there in any given area. So for example, here in this terrestrial one, which is on land, you have 15,200 kilograms of grasses can support 1,520 kilograms of grasshoppers, which can support 152 kilograms of mice, which can support 15 kilograms of snakes. So again, you notice your vast majority of biomass, or number of organisms, is taken up at the producer level, and then your apex predators is a very small relative amount. Okay, this explains why the apex predators are so small compared to the producers. So as you go from the sun to matter, okay, now you've got your excuse me, C6H12O6, which is your basic building block of biological organisms. So this now is matter. This is the matter that contains the energy that will support that entire ecosystem. As this matter, this organism just does its everyday daily life things, it actually loses energy to heat. So it's consuming some of it, it's using some of its own energy, and then it's also losing energy to heat. Then you go, so this is your producer level, right? Then you go to your primary consumer, same thing. It consumes the grass, it stores some of that energy, it uses a lot of that energy just to maintain its everyday life, and then it also loses energy in the form of heat, because you're effectively a bunch of biological reactions going on, and a lot of those reactions will give off heat when they're happening. You'll learn more about endothermic and exothermic reactions when you take chemistry. Okay, next level, so you go from the primary consumer to, in this case, this bear is going to be your secondary consumer. Same thing. It's going to take a lot of the energy that it's gaining, a lot of the sugars and biological molecules that it's turning into energy from its diet. It will use just to survive every day, to get the energy it needs to move around, to breathe, to think, all of those things. And then it also will lose energy to heat. So every time you go up a level, from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer, you are losing a lot of the energy just to maintain that everyday life of that organism, and also in heat. So what this boils down to is we talk about what's called a 10% rule. So the greatest amount of energy is available at the producer level. The greatest amount of energy is available at the producer level. The least amount is available at the tertiary level. The 10% rule is that only about 10%, roughly, of the trophic level's energy is transferred to the next level. So if we're talking a pyramid, right? If you have 100% of the energy available there, you only have 10% of that energy available there, and only 1% of the original 100 available there, and only 0.1% available there. Because again, the organisms are using the energy to just do their living, and they're also giving that energy off as heat. So at every level, you're losing the amount of original energy that was produced by the producers. So when you look at this in terms of an actual number, so this is an energy pyramid, you're going to actually look at the numbers in calories or joules or some sort of energy unit that is available at each level. So one thing to keep in mind here is that a kilocalorie, so a kilocalorie is what is generally measured when you're talking about energy in food systems. In your food, this is equal to what you call a calorie. Calorie. Okay, so when you look at like the back of a box or something and you see how many calories a serving has in it, each calorie there is actually, in true energy terms, what would be a kilocalorie. Let's do this with actual real numbers here. So in this grass, these green plants, you have 1,000 calories. This would be your 100%, right? This would be the equivalent of your 100%. If only 10% of that is transferred up, your first level consumers, so your primary consumers, at this level, there will only be 10% available because only 10% goes up to the next level. So you lose 90% of the energy, okay? So that would be 100 kilocalories. Again, you go up to the next level to your secondary consumers. You can only take 10% of that 10% with you. So 10% of 100 is 10. So now you have only 10 kilocalories. So it takes, if you have 1,000, for every 1,000 kilocalories you have down here, you have 100 here, and then you're going to lose 90% again, which means you only have 10 here. So here, if you go up again, same thing, you're going to lose 90%. So at your tertiary level, that's only 1 calorie. Now, if you imagine in this particular scenario, how many, I should say, calories this owl needs to survive every day. So how many calories does this owl need? A lot more than 1, right? So for every 1 owl that you're going to support, you're going to take however many kilocalories it needs a day, and then you're going to have that equivalent in 1,000 kilocalories at the grass level. This is why you'll find lots and lots and lots of producers. You'll find a fair amount of primary consumers that can support a very few secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers are rare because so much of that energy is lost by the time it gets there. You need a lot of producers to even support a single owl in this case. You have to have a lot of grass in this area and thousands of grasshoppers in order to support enough moles that can support a population that can support even a single owl, let alone a dozen owls. So this is why, again, the prey animals populations have to be large in order to support any level of a predator population, and why the predators are often so sensitive to population swings when these start suffering, and these lower levels will decrease in population. You see a massive drop off of their population because it takes a lot to support even a single predator. Okay, so those are trophic levels, and between the trophic levels and understanding food chains and food webs, you should now be ready to work on your assignment, your activity that has to do with food webs.